Liberty or equality? I have read it. I read it so you don't have to. And now I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about this book. First of all, let's just get this out of the way. I am biased. I'm a Protestant, and he criticizes Protestantism a lot in this book. So I'm going to try and keep my personal opinion out of the book. I will here and there, say what I need to say if, for example, there's extra context that needs to be put in. But besides that, I'm not going to really try and put my personal opinion in too much. So, the format of this piece of literature is kind of interesting. It's not really a book um, in the traditional sense. It's more like a series of essays that have been cobbled together to make a book. The book doesn't actually share a like a lot of through line between each essay, but it shares a overall theme which can be split into like two halves. The first half is specifically a criticism of democracy, and then the second half is a criticism. It's sort of a criticism of democracy, but it's more of a criticism of Protestantism and trying to explain how through Protestantism you get democracy, and from democracy you get um, national socialism. So, the start of the chapter, um, the first part is chapter 1, Definitions and Basic Principles. This chapter starts by acknowledging that the book was written by a Catholic, therefore it leans on the Catholic tradition as its philosophic basis, so you can think Thomism. It's not that he's saying, "Oh, I'm biased," so to speak. It's more like he's acknowledging where he's coming from. And he defines freedom in this chapter as basically the greatest amount of self-determination which in a given situation is feasible, reasonable, and possible. Based on his definition and how he uses the terms freedom and liberty, it can kind of be assumed that he's not just talking about negative freedom or positive freedom, but sort of a bit of both. Because he mentions that, for example, communism isn't good, and free market capitalism with monopolies um, is also against the concept of freedom. The author then moves on to equality, which he first tells us that equality is not equity, which equity in this case would be a synonym for justice. Um, and considering he references Aristotle and the fact that Thomism is considered like um, basically a synthesis between Christianity and Aristotle, I think it would be best if you were to look at the term or the Aristotelian definition of equity or justice, and that's found in the Nicomachean Ethics. If you want to know where he's coming from with this sort of language, the author talks about Christian equality. The author talks about Christian equality, which he points out is not a value per se, but rather an acknowledgement that every human is under the same law before God, and that every child is born spiritually equal, however they may be physically and mentally unequal. Later in the book, he also points out that this equality is something that only exists at birth. Once you live out your life, things change. Saint John, when he died on the island of Patmos, was not spiritually equal to Judas when he hung himself. Um, the term equality, as it's used in this book, can be more described as virtue of things being the same or valuing things being the same. It's not the view that, you know, of things being fair, which is an important distinction to make. Um, and, it's for this a reason that The thesis, which I'll quote here, it suffices to say that the artificial establishment of equality is as little compatible with liberty as the enforcement of unjust laws of discrimination. Basically, equality as such is not a value because it's unnatural to humanity. And I think it's fair to say that basically every human characteristic exists on a bell curve. So in order to enforce equality, you have to reduce people's liberties. Another quote I'll point out is, nature is anything but egalitarian. If we want to establish a complete plane, we have to blast the mountains and fill the valleys. Equality thus presupposes the continuous intervention by force, which, as a principle, is opposed to freedom. Liberty and equality are in essence contradictory. And as you can tell, that quote basically cements this idea that they're not the same, they're actually contrary, because in order to have freedom, you can't have equality, and so on and so forth. The author then moves on to talk about how Anglos, that's you and me, use the term liberal and democratic. So here's a problem. The author points out that liberal should mean someone who's pro-liberty, or it should mean pro-liberty. But the reality is that it's not the case. So liberalism really is progressivism in the modern sense of the term. And one of the things to point out is any liberal who reads, The Republic by Plato would assume that democracy will be sort of dialectically upstream from tyranny, and therefore a true liberal, will be anti-democratic. He then talks about how the term liberal is used in practice and points out that it's used as a label for people who are not necessarily pro-liberty. For example, he states that the term liberal in the United States is labeled that really means progressive, even though progressives may not in fact be pro-liberty. He then goes on to talk about how some people have used the term and then speculates on the Christian position for liberalism, finally ending the talk about liberalism with stating that Whiggism, or radical capitalism, for lack of a better term, is also anti-liberal according to his definition, as the concentration of wealth at the top that is a result of capitalism necessarily leads to a less free society. Now, on to talking about the term democracy. Democracy is a political term which implies power from the people. The author makes the distinction between the cultural and political use of the term. For example, a quote-unquote democratic way of life is a social term that isn't really important. Furthermore, the love of the people, or demophilia, is not democracy. On a personal tangent, I feel like a lot of online leftists are demophiles in the sense they advocate for the working class or the common man in the abstract sense. But in reality, they do not like your average man. They hate people who are farmers or oil rig workers, what have you. The common laborer. It's just a weird thing. I don't know. Anyway, back to the book. When he talks about whether or not, he then goes on to talk about whether or not Jefferson was Democratic. He argues that Jefferson was a Republican, not a Democrat, as well as some of the founding fathers. The difference between a Republican and a Democrat, for our intents and purposes, is the extent of the voting bloc. Rome was a republic, but limited how many people could vote. The author argues that the United States was not a democracy until Andrew Jackson became president, which would mean that the US basically was not a democracy for the first 40 years or so. The next point that is made is that in Anglo countries, democracy and liberalism are often assumed to be one and the same thing. Quote, one of the most important differences between the continental and Anglo-Saxon tradition of representative government has to be found in the important alloy which has been so far the almost inseparable concomitant of the latter, Whiggery or liberalism in the classic sense. And quote, but the vast majority of Americans and Englishmen talking about democracy always include the liberal element in their concept of democracy. The issue with this definition is the fact that, conceptually, there's nothing wrong with being an illiberal democratic, or having an illiberal democratic state or a liberal non-democratic state. A liberal king could ensure more freedom for his people than a democracy that does not care for the freedoms of the common man. There's nothing inherently undemocratic about 51% of the population voting to oppress the other 49%. It is also pointed out that a dictatorship of the proletariat can be democratic if the proletariat makes a majority, even if the population does not vote. This is to mean that a country like the USSR, in some sense, is democratic because it's the government of the USSR exists to represent the people. It is also implied that a major reason democracy has been a success in the USA is because of the fact that Americans are, by and large, liberals, wanting and guaranteeing freedom for the people, even if it's not democratic. This is important to point out, as not every country shares the liberal sentiments of Anglo-Saxons. Chapter 2: Democracy and Totalitarianism, the Prophets. This chapter focuses on one basic idea. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle have argued that tyranny will dialectically follow a democracy due to the philosophic and practical issues inherent in democracy. The basic idea is that the masses will want to take wealth from the elites in a society. This will lead to the elites being expropriated until they quote-unquote fight back, for lack of a better term, which then leads to a class conflict until the masses elect some sort of demagogue who will attack the elites and intellectuals until he forcefully takes over the society and becomes a tyrant. This pattern took place in the 1930s, in Eastern Europe in 1917, as well as after the French Revolution. This chapter is kind of like a giant I told you so, where he quotes political thinkers who saw people basically saying, oh, this is going to end in tyranny, or, after a tyranny does appear, they go, oh, wow, we all saw that coming because of X, Y, and Z. And it's people who just manage to connect the dots. And then these people will attribute these sorts of problems to the ideas of uniformism, illiberalism, totalitarianism, state growth, collectivism, and finally despotism in Russia. I'll go through each one of these ideas and give a quote of someone talking about it from the book. The big through line of this chapter is to argue that democracy by nature is egalitarian, in the sense that it argues that everyone is equally capable of making decisions about the future of the country. This value of egalitarianism can also be applied as everyone should be equal, not just in regard to political power. This leads ultimately to everyone being made to be the same. And to do that, you need more power. That is how you get the values of uniformism, collectivism, for egalitarianism, for totalitarianism, illiberalism, and state growth. These are all necessary in order to enforce the equality. This chapter focuses on that basic idea. Okay, well, let's get started. Uniformism. The quote for uniformism comes from the Russian Tsarist Konstantin Leontiev, who recognized that the core uniformist ideals of the French Revolution have prevailed, and they have shaped the organization of both Bonapartist empires in France and are now influencing Germany after its victory in the Franco-Prussian War. The pure race, centralization, egalitarianism, a constitution of sufficient strength that a man of genius will not dare to engineer a coup d'etat, support to industry and trade in opposition to all the aforementioned, a strengthening and a union of all elements of anarchy. Finally, militarism, point for point imperial France. The nuances or differences are, from the broader and higher point of view which we are now talking, so insignificant that it is not worth while even to think about them. The victory of the national, racial, tribal policy has thus brought to the Germans a loss of national personality. Germany, after her victories, has been more Gallicized than ever before in her very being, her administration, her structures, her laws. Important aspects of her personal and local culture have suddenly faded away. This will surely not influence the character of Germany in 50 years, right? Like, this is definitely not going to influence how Germany acts in 50 years' time, right? Anyway, um, on to the. I'm going to just skip a few quotes here and just move on to liberalism. Keep it quite simple, one quote for each. For illiberalism, this quote comes from the German socialist Eduard Heimann, who said the following: True Hitlerism proclaims itself as true democracy and true socialism, and the terrible truth is that there is a grain of truth to such claims. But one fact stands out with perfect clarity in all the fog. Hitler has never claimed to represent true liberalism. Liberalism, then, has the distinction of being the doctrine most hated by Hitler. And we can also read from Johann Jacob Backhofen, who wrote to Jacob Burckhardt the following letter. Since the victory of Lucerne, the dogma of popular sovereignty and the omnipotence of democracy has become the practical basis of our public institutions. I do not doubt that this ideology is going to proceed to all, even the most extreme conclusion, if the conclusions of Europe permit it, and if great catastrophes do not lead the people back to the true foundations of sound political life. Yet complete democracy is the end of everything good. Republics have the most to fear from it. I tremble at the thought of its expansion, not on account of property, but because democracy throws us back into barbarism. For this is the curse of democracy, that it carries its devastations into all domains of life, affects church, home, and family most severely, and distorts the true point of view on all questions, even the smallest ones. Because I love freedom, I hate democracy. Totalitarianism. Consider one fact, gentlemen. In antiquity, tyranny was savage and pitiless, and yet this despotism was physically limited because all states were small and because international relations were altogether non-existent. As a result, there could be in antiquity no tyrannies on a large scale with the exception of Rome. But today things have changed. Gentlemen, the paths have been cleared for a gigantic, colossal, universal and immense tyranny. There are no physical obstacles, because with the steamships and railroads there are no boundaries left, there are no distances, and there are no moral obstacles, because all minds are divided and all patriotisms are dead. Tell me, then, whether or not I am right in being preoccupied with the immediate future of the world. Tell me whether, in dealing with this problem, I am not dealing with the real question. Donoso Cortés, who lived between the 6th of May, 1809, and the 3rd of May 1853. State growth. I'm just going to throw in a book recommendation here before I talk about this one. The Crowd, A Study of a Popular Mind, also talks about this, the issue of state growth, that is. Anyway, here's a quote from Pierre-Paul Royer-Collard, who lived from 1763 to 1845. We have seen the old society perish, and with it this great number of local institutions and independent tribunals which formed part and parcel of it. With these powerful symbols of personal privileges, true republics within the framework of the monarchy, these institutions, these tribunals, it is true, did not share the prerogatives of sovereignty, but they set limits to it, which honor defended with stubbornness. Not one of them has survived, and no new ones have been put in their place. The revolution has left nothing standing but individuals. The dictatorship which has set an end to it has, in this respect, completed the work of its predecessor. From a society ground to dust emerged centralization. Centralization has not arrived as so many other, no less dangerous doctrines, with bold arrogance and the authority of a principle. It has insinuated itself modestly, as a consequence, as a necessary evil. Indeed, where we have nothing but "individuals," all that matters which are not properly theirs are public affairs, affairs of the state. This is how we have become an administered nation. Zam, that's crazy. Collectivism. Barthold George Niebuhr, sorry, I can't pronounce German, wrote in 1820 the following. All of Europe is menaced by wild revolutions and an iron despotism, while Germany is being driven into an alien servitude. Spain no less so. It is possible that no punishment could be too mild for King Ferdinand. But remember my prophecy. The Constitution, this anarchical monstrosity, if really enacted, will not last 6 months. A large part of the country will not have anything to do with it, whole provinces, as a matter of fact. And here also no other wisdom seems to be available than the idol of flat uniformity, to whom millions should sacrifice their liberty. Under these conditions nothing else can be expected but a military rule, and this again means mutual antagonisms until one wins and one is overthrown. We drift towards conditions reminding us of the Roman Empire, when absolute princes ruled without legal succession. Our hereditary dynasties are our good fortune, which we will realize once we have lost them. Not every hereditary dynasty falls into that category. It is possible that the sins of the House of Spain may have been formidable, but I still feel with complete certitude that a catastrophe in that direction is the gravest misfortunes. For those curious about what Spain did and what Constitution Niebuhr is talking about, the Constitution was the Spanish Constitution of 1812, and in 1820 a revolution in Spain overthrew the king. This government lasted until 1823, when France invaded. Longer than 6 months, but one election cycle isn't exactly an achievement, I would say. That being said, I won't comment any further because I really don't know Spanish history, and I don't want to overstep my bounds. Finally, Russia. François-René de Chateaubriand said the following at a dinner party in 1817, predicting the Franco-Prussian War and World War I. In 50 years there will not be a legitimate sovereign in Europe. From Russia to Sicily I foresee nothing but military despotism, and in a hundred, the cloud is too dark for human vision, too dark. It may almost be said to be penetrated by philosophy. There, perhaps, is the misery of our situation. Perhaps we live not only in the decrepitude of Europe, but the decrepitude of the world. Marquis de Custine, 1843. Have given the world a great and useful lesson, which Russia had to pay for. They have shown us that despotism is never a greater menace when it claims to do good. Under these circumstances, it excuses its most revolting acts by its intentions, and evil posing as a remedy has no limits. Alexis de Tocqueville, in 1855, saw the spectre of Russia over Europe and feared the Russians would attempt to invade and control Europe. This came true after the Second World War to a limited extent. To quote, I think with you that Russia is a great danger to Europe. I think so more strongly because I have had peculiar opportunities of studying the real source of her power, and because I believe these sources to be permanent, and entirely beyond the reach of foreign attack. I have not the time to tell you why, but I am deeply convinced that it is not taking from her a town or even a province, nor by diplomatic relations, still less by placing sentinels along her frontier, that Western powers will permanently stop her progress. A temporary bulwark may be raised against her, but a mere accident may destroy it, or a change of alliance or of domestic policy may render it useless. I am convinced that Russia can be stopped only by raising before her powers created by the hatred which she inspires, whose vital and constant interest it shall be to keep themselves united and to keep her in other words, by the resurrection of Poland and by the reanimation of Turkey. I do not believe that either of these means can now be adopted. The detestable jealousies and ambitions of the European nations resemble, as you say in your letter, nothing better than the quarrels of the Greeks in the face of Philip. Not one will sacrifice her passions or objects. In summary, I will leave you with a quote from Alexander Herzen. Possible that a few more or less tolerable decades, something in the style of the Roman Empire, are still ahead of us. In fact, I am of the opinion that democracy and the proletariat, even if they are mad enough to attempt resistance, will have to give way to an increasingly harsh despotism. Chapter 3. A Critique of Democracy. The Basic Problem. Here the author reiterates the basic issue of democracy. Democracy is egalitarian in nature, and egalitarianism naturally leads to tyranny, or a forceful leveling of society, whereas liberty as a concept is based on the freedom given to an individual regardless of the whims of the state, meaning if the majority desire to have a liberal policy, there is nothing undemocratic about that. In other words, so long as the oppression and tyranny you suffer has popular support, it's okay and democratic. Moral aspects of democracy. The first question to ask is, what is the moral character of the state? Our author argues that the state is a product of human limitation, mortality, and, to a certain extent, evil. To put it in this perspective, if every human that walked the earth was immortal, perfectly intelligent, and perfectly moral, there would be no need for a state. For example, take crime. There would be no need for a police force or law enforcers in general if no one ever committed assault or stole from each other or anything else like that. What would be the point? Same with regulation. If you could trust that the baker is not putting sawdust in his bread, or that the chef at the local restaurant keeps his kitchen perfectly clean and his ingredients fresh, there would be no need to inspect these businesses. I think you guys get the point. If humans were perfect, there would be no need for a government. Conversely, it is precisely because humans are flawed that we need a state. Furthermore, A type of government such as democracy would be completely functional if, and only if, you presume everyone is intellectually, morally, and spiritually sound. But as a Christian, one must acknowledge that humans are limited, weak, and sinful. Therefore, there is a direct conflict with the moral beliefs and presuppositions of the Christian faith. On one hand, humans are sinners, stupid and limited, and on the other, if you're presuming democracy is viable, they are perfectly knowledgeable, moral, and capable of steering a nation. Furthermore, there's the issue of the local will versus the pan-provincial general will. For an illustration of this issue, the author brings up the island of Ireland. Had there been a vote for Irish independence instead of a civil war, the island as a majority would have voted to leave. However, Ulster would have voted to stay. However, the counties of Fermanagh and Tyrone in Ulster would have voted to leave with the rest of Ireland, and no doubt some baronies within these counties would have voted to be with Ulster, and so on. Basically, where do you draw the line on this topic? Lastly, there is the issue with the fact that modern democracies have non-democratic elements in them. For example, the United States has the Senate and the Supreme Court, which are undemocratic institutions that undermine majority rule. This last issue is less of a critique of democracy in and of itself, but a critique of the people who defend these kinds of democracy. I mean, after all, it is perfectly possible in 2025, in the 21st century, to have a democratic government that is a direct democracy using things like modern technology to make it so perhaps every night you, as an individual member of the state, get to vote on all the political issues instead of having representatives vote for you. Difficulties and illustrations. The first difficulty is that in order for democracy to work, everyone must be on board with democracy, or at least have a common framework/belief system. If you have a nation that has a cocktail of ideologies or belief systems, then democracy is far more likely to be annexed by an undemocratic party that infiltrates the government. If the two major parties we see in Anglo countries become too different, then each election becomes a bloodless revolution, where all that happens is that each government undoes what the previous government does. If this is to happen, the country will just go in circles and never move forward. Furthermore, the representative style of democracy in Anglo countries lends itself to poor representation, as a government can be elected for however many years, enact policies that no one approves of, and only after so many years will this government change. Going back to the issue of the parties being too different, it means that if you want a functional democracy, there must be a common ideology. This comes with an interesting sociological issue in Anglo democracies, where you legally have many liberties, but there is greater societal pressure to ideologically conform, because you must conform to the general will in order to be a functional member of the democracy. The constitution that has been adopted by the USA is only effective at maintaining the liberty of Americans because of the cultural character of the USA, that being its Protestant character. South and Central American countries have successfully adopted the Constitution of the USA, but this has not led to the South and Central American countries having their democracy and their liberty secured, as they have still managed to become dictatorships. It's also important to reiterate the fact that this book was written in 1952, and if you look at a democracy map of Europe at that time, you see why this is a problem. Self-government. The first issue that needs to be deconstructed is the idea that the people are choosing their own government. This is not really true. A faction of the people choose the government, and that faction may or may not represent you. For example, I highly doubt that a Democrat living under Trump feels like they are governed themselves. or governed by their own beliefs. Next is the raw fact that in a democracy, you don't really have say, meaning your vote is just one among many millions, and your political views cannot be accurately represented by one of the two parties. Chances are you have views that go against the party you vote for in the next election. Which will also strike at another issue. It is only self-government. If you suppose that you as an individual is the same person as the collective mass of votes in this party or that president. Obviously, most people will not say, I am the Republican Party and the Republican Party is me, unless you're some fanatical MAGA guy or something. So for most people, the idea that your government is the government you voted in is sort of incorrect. For the same reasons, the slogan government by consent of the governed is kind of silly and arbitrary. The author then mentions the issue of the fact that representative democracies easily become oligarchies in disguise, where you have entrenched groups who, quote unquote, manipulate votes through their power structures such as the media. In other words, if a corporation tells you what to believe and buys out a politician who validates the concerns the corporation told you to worry about, are you really governing yourself? The author then drops the following names on this whole hidden oligarchy idea before moving on to the next topic. Some of these names include H.G. Wells, James Burnham, Sir Henry Maine, Rene Schwab, and Professor A.H. Lloyd. Ethics and representation. Democracy has an issue of responsibility. This first comes from the democratic structure itself. When a bad policy is made into law, who is responsible? The people who voted in the government, the elected government, or the bureaucrats who enforced the new policy? It is clear every time something bad happens in a democracy, the blame game starts. The people will blame the leader will say, I'm just enacting the will of the people, or the bureaucrats are to blame for their poor interpretation of the law, and the bureaucrats can blame the leaders or the people. No one takes responsibility. Conversely, in a monarchy, even though the king is technically only answerable to God, in reality it is himself who bears the weight of his actions, or his children who will inherit the state. Next comes the issue of representation, because a politician is meant to represent the beliefs of the people. A politician will undermine his own values and beliefs in order to appeal to the masses. This creates a dilemma where the democratic politician might find himself in, where his constituents are demanding something immoral, yet to secure votes and further his career he must lie and betray his conscience. Basically, the democratic politician is a sophist if he wants any chance at being elected, with no backbone or morals. For this reason, the author argues it is basically impossible for a good Christian to become a democratic politician. It's kind of funny, he gives some hypothetical examples of how politicians might act on a given topic, and the one labeled bad pagan sounds just like Trump in my head. Here you can see an example on screen. I mean, if you look at bad pagan, it's kind of funny. The canal has always been on my top agenda. Sure, I'll vote for it. This state is gonna have the finest, broadest, bluest, and smoothest canal in the world. What are your thoughts? What are you gonna do about our relations to Mexico? We don't trust her. Nobody in his senses ever trusts Mexico. We won't play sucker to her again. And, and the big stick remains. The best policy, we're gonna break off diplomatic relations with her. That's what I'm gonna vote for. The author makes the distinction between a republic and a democracy. In a democracy, a politician has re-election as a top priority, whereas in a republic, an elected official will just return to his normal business after everything is said and done, as he would be more concerned with doing the right thing rather than continuing his political career. Knowledge. This one is a basic critique. In a small town hall, where the issues and happenings of the village can be understood by all, democracy does not really have a knowledge problem, as everyone is capable of knowing and understanding everything they need. However, in a democracy with millions of inhabitants, can you really expect every individual to be an expert on the necessary issues of ethics, politics, economics, geography, law, etc.? It's not feasible that the everyday person could possibly make an informed vote. As a matter of fact, it may also be difficult for a career politician to make an informed vote, as his skills and knowledge are taken up in the field of politics and not statecraft. As for universal education, it's not necessarily sufficient to fill the gaps. He then compares this to the Middle Ages, where people represented themselves according to their knowledge and their abilities. On a tangent, for those of you who don't know, in the Middle Ages, many people were members of organizations such as guilds. Guilds can be thought of as a mix of a university, a union, and a lobby group. So a smith would be a part of the smithing guild, where he would train in smithing until he is a smith himself. This guild may help him find work and will represent his interests to the government. Many occupations had such organizations, and many other similar societies existed in medieval times. So this is what the author is referencing. Fun fact, in a guild, to gain the status of master, you had to produce a very high quality work. This was called a masterpiece, and is the origin of the term master's degree for university. Anyway, back to the book. The author then argues that because people are ignorant, they instead primarily vote either in an uninformed way or using emotion. If not purely on emotion, then a blend of emotion and snippets of information. This obviously leads to poor decision making and conflict between the bureaucratic elements of our government and the democratic elements. Finally, due to ignorance, there is a time lag. People will often learn about an issue after the issue has affected them, instead of preventing it and learning about it before it has happened. Shadows of tyranny. The first thing that is mentioned is that with a democracy, there must be conformity, which causes the intellectual scene to become stale and unmoving. Democracy is basically anti-intellectual. The next claim is that the worship of the everyman, for lack of a better term, is also a product of democracy and is inherently unchristian. There is nothing good about holding the lowest common denominator in high regard or pressuring people to be like the lowest common denominator. One should look upwards to God, not sideways to man. On this note, he says that Christianity as a religion is anti-populistic. After all, our Lord did say that most people are going to hell, and Scripture tells us that everyone is a sinner, and it also says not to conform to the whims of society, but to obey the word of God. Next, on to tyranny itself. The author now goes on to talk about the fact that communism and fascism not only came out of the democratic system, but claim to be democratic. He states this is not a bug, but a feature. In many nations, if you install a democracy and wait, you will get a tyranny in due time. For example, what happened to Germany, Italy, and Russia. At the time he wrote this book, in 1952, he said that there were only 3 surviving liberal democracies: the USA, Switzerland, and arguably Finland. He also mentions the failing of democracy in Greece, Spain, Portugal, and South America as further examples of this issue. He mentions in a free society that dissident views are not a problem, but in a democracy where conformity to ideology is needed to maintain political power, conformity and crushing dissent become necessary for the continuation of your party or ideology. Therefore, this democracy becomes a poor basis for a free society. He also makes an interesting comparison on a point of ideological struggle, which is interesting. A king who is suffering from schizophrenia would naturally be taken out of power, but a democracy divided completely against itself, even if it's policy-wise, would be the same thing but wouldn't be taken out of power. The author asserts that democracy has only really worked in some Protestant countries due to these countries' religion and culture, and for that reason, democracy won't work as well in a Catholic nation. In other words, democracy lends itself more favorably to Protestant countries/cultures than Catholic ones. On a side note, I want to ask the viewer to extend this view to Islam. Can anyone point to a majority Islamic country today that is a functioning democracy and not an authoritarian regime? No. Uh, anyway, back to the book. The author argues that democracy is more compatible in Protestant countries due to the fact that it is relatively more ecumenical than Catholicism. A Protestant will say that Catholics, Orthodox, or any other Protestant from a different denomination can be saved, whereas the Catholic Church insists that Catholicism is the only way to heaven. Extra ecclesiam nulla salus. There is no salvation outside the Church. Though, since Vatican II, the Catholic Church has rolled back on this doctrine and now believes in the invisible church like us prots. How does this yapping about theological differences relate to politics, you ask? Well, the author argues that ecumenicalism naturally lends itself to having a more relativistic view on things, meaning it's easier for a Protestant to cooperate with someone they disagree with, whereas Catholicism has a more absolutist character that does not really lend itself to cooperation like that. This is an issue for a Catholic in a democracy because it means that he is less likely to cooperate with a political opposition. Since democracy is built on compromise, this is an issue. Additional aspects of the problem. The first issue is that a pure democracy is a direct democracy, which would be technologically achievable in the 21st century, but in most cases we have a hybrid system of democracy with an alloy of oligarchy in the form of a parliament or senate and monarchy in the form of a president, prime minister, or actual monarch. Next, to sufficiently educate the whole population in order for them to vote is effectively impossible as there is simply too much to teach. Furthermore is the question of if the education won't devolve into a form of political indoctrination, which everyone fears, and it kind of is the case. It is. He then goes on to argue that Pope Pius XII did not endorse democracy, and that the nations that do not have a common denominator are frozen politically because they go nowhere. That is, democratic nations without a common denominator. And finally, the author concedes that the book thus far has not compared democracy with any other form of government, and the author is making these criticisms from a European democratic state. For context, he lives in America, and so he will now segue into the next chapter. Chapter 4, Democracy and Monarchy. The question. First, this chapter starts off with a list of all the issues relating to democracy that have been written before, and that is the main part of the start, so let's read it. 1. With the exception of direct democracy, democracy is not self-government. 2. Voters are irrational and ignorant. 3. It corrupts society. 4. It is an inefficient use of human resources. 5. It is inherently relativistic and leads to bad things like ethnic nationalism. 6. It is incompatible with liberty. 7. It dialectically leads to tyranny. 8. It works only with strong social pressure/conformity. 9. It is collectivistic and anti-personalistic. And 10. It has historically been only successful in some Protestant countries. The essence of a monarchy. The author points out that even though monarchy as a concept is intimately entwined with European history. The very concept of monarchy is foreign to most Americans, and that they assume monarchy is backwards and that democracy is progressive, despite the fact that Europe progressed from a democratic republic into a monarchy. He then goes on to explain monarchy, stating that the European monarchy was typically of a constitutional character, though thought of as an institution, and that the monarch was thought of more as a quote unquote father figure of the state, in the sense that he is not superhuman, he has responsibility for those below him, and that the relationship ought to be fair. The author then talks about the paternalistic character of society and its psychology, distinguishing it psychologically from fraternal society or psychology, implying that the paternal model offers more stability, peace, and respect, whereas the fraternal one is more violent and animalistic, collectivistic, racialistic, etc. The fraternal being an analog to democratic society, of course. The author then goes on to mention that monarchy has historically been non-racist or non-racialist, as the king is often ethnically a foreigner, and that many kings are often cherished by their people. The monarch is a ruler. This is compared slightly to the plebiscitarian dictator such as Napoleon, who is more tyrannical and totalitarian. Finally, he mentions that monarchy is a higher form of government, basically saying that monarchical nations are more civilized. To be honest, I didn't really get this point, but I thought I'd add it. The caricature of monarchy. The author repeats the idea that a dictatorship is downstream from a democracy. He then goes on to point out that what has saved democratic nations like Britain and the US in the world wars was geographic isolation, not necessarily their government. Furthermore, that democratic governments are kind of indecisive, even compared to dictatorships. He then goes on to say that Americans have had a hard time distinguishing between dictatorship and monarchy, and that the concept of monarchy establishing itself is something Americans fear. There are sociological and psychological reasons for this, one of which is that Western society has a very relatively low view of patriarchy or the patriarch in general. However, he does say that pro-patriarchal sentiments in continental Europe and Asia are more common. This patriarchal tendency is argued to be one of the causes for why plebiscitarian dictatorships rose across Europe after democracy was established. The examples of countries are as follows: Spain, Portugal, Germany, Austria, Russia, France, Hungary. The author states that these dictators are monarchs minus some essential attributes, or can be thought of as a pseudo-monarchy, for lack of a better term. Patriarchal, yes, but lacking the matriarchal counterbalance of interrelationship, lack of material ties with the nation, inheritance of office, absence of vested interests in specific classes, and training for the profession. Continuing on dictators, they will typically try to embody the everyman, which helps play into the uniformistic character of a dictatorship. See, this dictator, he's just like you and me, same race, same class, same beliefs. Embodying the paternal character, however, a papa leader, so to speak. Unlike the Christian monarch who is restrained by the church and Christian law, however, these men are free to do what they please. So you get tyranny from a duce or Führer. The running dialectic idea is brought up yet again, and I feel like sharing this quote straight from the book because I think it is quite powerful in encapsulating the emotion behind this idea. The reassertion of the natural father urge does not result in the restitution of the paternal kingdom, but the rise of the terrifying father, a Kronos devouring his own children, who are paralyzed by his magnetic glare, like rabbits facing a boa constrictor. In the words of E. Junger, decayed altars are inhabited by demons. He then asserts the view that in order for this tyranny to come about, the citizenry must be immoral and slavish. And he goes on to reassert that Plato, Polybius, and Aristotle all affirmed this dialectic future of democracy, but that from a tyranny you can dialectically get a peaceful, legitimate monarchy. But it is very slow and long, because it can only happen once the tyrant loosens his grip and all mutual trust can develop between the nation and the nation's leader. This often happens via a change of dynasty. The Bonapartes, some argue, began to achieve that quasi-legitimacy among the French population during their reign. Zog, the first of Albania, came close as well, but his path was cut short by a foreign invasion. Another issue standing in the way of legitimate monarchy in our time is the fact that people love democracy. For many, any non-democratic regime is illegitimate. Also, in America especially, monarchy is not liked, as Americans will conceptualize monarchy through the books by people like Mark Twain and his book Connecticut Yankee at the King's Court, and Little King by Slogov. Also, because people think of Kaiser Wilhelm when they think of monarchy, it gives a very bad reputation in the Anglosphere. Jumping to the patriarchal symbol or paternal symbol, the author does concede that the West is not wholly against it. After all, there are some symbols like Uncle Sam for the US or John Bull for the UK. But he goes on to say that democracy is feminine in nature and that democratic civilization is far more matriarchal, maternal, and fraternal than it is paternal, repeating that democracy appeals to demagoguery, emotional thinking, and that it is collectivistic in nature. He then goes on to assert that conformism and social pressure is a strong part of democratic society. And he makes a funny analogy for this, where he says, would you rather be in a prison with a hostile warden or in a prison with hostile inmates? Finally, he reasserts that liberty is most achievable in a monarchical society, due to the lack of social and horizontal pressure. Monarchy compared with democracy. Firstly, as an individual, under any form of government, the power you hold is virtually invisible. For an American, your one vote is virtually meaningless in a nation with well over 100 million voters. This was written in 1952. Now the population's over 300 million, which is even crazier. However, personalities can have an outstanding impact on any regime. Voltaire, Leibniz, Hobbes, and others have had profound impacts on the monarchs. One difference becomes clear though. Personalities in a democratic society can likewise influence the masses. However, unlike the masses, monarchs have a great education. Therefore, the monarch has a better ability to discern poor political theory or philosophy from good political theory or philosophy. The same cannot be said for the average person who has a meager education in comparison. Next comes a list of comparisons between monarchy and democracy meant to demonstrate that monarchy is superior. 1. Democracy is characterized by party rule, ideological thinking. Monarchs are dissociated from such negative traits as there is no need for them to conform to party line. A monarch can rule not just through the law, but also through prestige and primary rule, which makes ruling easier. So, 3. Unlike a democratically elected leader, a monarch is trained from birth for the role of leadership, and thus has more experience. 4. A political careerist is less likely to be moral, as the role attracts and necessitates a lack of humility or moral fiber, whereas a monarch also undergoes spiritual training to ensure he has a good moral character. 5. The point's the same as 4. Kings were trained to be humble. 6. Because of the way monarchs were bred, for lack of a better term, they typically had outstandingly high IQs and were often good statesmen. 7. Monarchs rarely engage in total wars, risking the devastation of the entire kingdom over a single war. Nor is war as big and devastating. However, Napoleon and Mustache Man engaged in massive total wars. 8. European monarchs were also mixed ethnically, which meant they had less racialist or ethnic prejudices. 9. Like 8, many monarchs had steppe, Semitic, or quote-unquote foreign blood, meaning they were less likely to be racialist or racist. 10. St. Thomas Aquinas argues monarchy unites a population under one ruler. Democracy divides a population into factions. 11. Monarchy is not oligarchical like democracy or aristocracy is. 12. Monarchy is a form of government that synergizes well with Christianity. It is a very Christian form of government, whereas democracy is not. 13. Monarchy is a natural form of government. 14. Monarchs are often more moral and more religious. There are, for this reason, many more saints who are monarchs than there are elected officials who are saints. 15. Monarchy does not necessitate the social pressure to conform to party line. Also, democratic governments can get away with more draconic laws because people think they consented to them. 16. Again, monarchy is a more intellectually free society, as there is less pressure to conform to mainstream ideology. 17. Monarchs are already secure in wealth and position, so they do not need to take bribes to access power or money. And if they do squander wealth, it usually brings on things like lavish art or public works. Corruption is more common in democracies and usually results in the hoarding of wealth. 18. Monarchy is not plutocratic, whereas democracy often is. 19. There is no need for demagoguery in a monarchy, yet it is common in democracy. 20. Because democracy is majoritarian, the tyranny of the majority over the minority is more common than in monarchies. Minorities typically fare better under monarchy than in democracy. 21. In a democracy, it is easy to avoid responsibility for one's actions or mistakes, whereas, even though on paper the monarch is only responsible to God, he is the one who will bear the responsibility for all of his decisions. 22. Again, monarchies are often forced to marry foreigners due to marriage laws. Also, one can consider a monarch public property. I didn't really get that point. 23. Because monarchs are handing the kingdom down to their children, they will also be in power for a very long time. They are incentivized not to be reckless. whereas a democratically elected leader can be as reckless as he likes, and the worst he'll get is being voted out at the next election. On a personal side note, it's a known strategy for governments to overspend and be reckless, because if they time it right, they can spend all the money and make everything look good while they are in power, and then when the other party gets in, the economy can crash with no budget to fix it. 24. A monarchy can plan with a longer time span in mind. There won't be a regime change anytime soon, whereas a democratic government can't, because plans will change every time a new government comes in. 25. The modern age, with all its complexities and specializations, would suit a monarchy with a bureaucracy better than a democracy. Amateurs running the government wouldn't be better than lifetime statesmen. 26. Voting in and voting out governments is not really helpful, especially in retrospect, as the masses have historically voted in many bad governments. Therefore, the masses don't really have a good eye for a candidate. Furthermore, if we are playing an odds game, the high turnover rate of democracy means the odds of getting a really, really bad government are higher. 27. There have been far more brilliant statesmen produced by monarchic regimes than by democratic regimes, yet very poor statesmen or failures are seemingly produced by non-monarchic regimes. Compare a Bismarck to a Mustache Man, a Marazin to a Marat, a Pašić to a Tito. You get the point. 28. The inheritance laws of a monarchy made the countries less corrupt. Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Bohemia-Moravia were more corrupt in 1919 than when they were monarchies. 29. Democracy is more exposed to foreign intervention than monarchy because the government remains static, whereas in democracy, elections can be interfered with. For this reason, Catherine II of Russia was furious when the Poles switched to a hereditary monarchy in 1792. Also, to all the Americans watching, could you think of any foreign country that might be influencing your politics? I can think of 3. 30. Finally, plebiscitarian dictatorships are very much incompatible with monarchy. The only main example from recent memory is Mussolini, but even then this partnership was short-lived until the Duce took full power. The author finishes off this chapter by offering what he believes to be another reason the American can't really authentically believe in democracy, which is historical context. Someone who has lived in a European city such as Rome or Athens has, through the aeons, seen more or less every type of government in that city. America has only seen one. He then says that democracy has an anti-Catholic, or rather an anti-Christian character to it. Supplementary note: Neo-Thomism and the problem of authority. I'll spare you most of this section because it's more about the author himself rather than being relevant to the thesis of this book. Basically, the author does not like what he calls Neo-Thomism, which, in his view, is taking the writings of and philosophy of Thomas Aquinas too holistically, using it to explain everything, rather than what the author believes you should do, which is using Thomism as a foundation on which one can build his worldview. The author then says that he is a religious existentialist with a Thomistic foundation. The issue of authority comes up next. The core issue is this: authority and power are actually two separate concepts that are often confused. Authority can be described as something like the rightful privilege of wielding power, whereas power could be described as the ability to enforce your will. Meaning that not everyone who has power has authority, but everyone who has authority has power. He then goes on to argue that monarchs operate with authority, whereas democratic governments only operate with power. The argument is broadly as follows. In some sense, the nation is the quote-unquote property of the king. The king therefore has the right to do as he wishes with his property for the end of the common good. When a king is operating towards the common good, he is acting as a servant of God and has authority. The king, however, loses his authority the moment he stops acting towards the common good. In a democracy, power is dissolved to the masses. These people often vote for irrational and emotional reasons that undermine the common good, not necessarily in its entirety, but it is so often warped in some way. With the example of universal education, which is meant to educate, but is often a tool for regimenting people to become uniform. In other words, the issue is that power is not answerable to the common good, whereas authority is. This creates an issue in democracy where power can be used for evil without institution change, so long as it is the quote-unquote will of the people. The author points out that regime change in monarchy is by no means unheard of, and in some circumstances rebellion against tyranny is morally righteous. On to reason. It can be argued that reason is the ability to discern authority, with authority pointing to God. How God diffuses authority to the people is a question of speculation, but reason would show that authority is not primarily in the hands of the people, the masses, rather it would be the magistrate, giving a philosophic argument as to why the people, or masses, have not authority. This again reinforces the view that democracy is anti-Christian. As for the people themselves, it's fair to say that the view that the masses are sounder of mind or reasonable really does not make sense, as the average person is not taught reason or has no training in it. This is not some insult like people are dumb, but rather they are uneducated, and it's probably not plausible to educate them all sufficiently. And I think this is personally a really important point. Um, how many people do you know have actually read anything on formal logic, or philosophy, or epistemology, or metaphysics, or have read a single book on political theory? It's a serious question. The author then gives a personal anecdote of when he arrived to the USA in 1937. The New Deal was the question of the day. The author writes that he and his wife worked intensely to educate themselves as best they could on the issue, but gave up after realizing it would take several months to come to an educated position on the topic. They estimated only a couple thousand Americans would actually be in a position to make an educated vote. However, despite this, about 70 million Americans, voters and non-voters, had extremely deep convictions about the topic, despite the profounding ignorance of these people. The author then goes on to argue against Catholics who invoke the democratic principle. The author points out that the popes of the past have not endorsed power from the bottom up, but rather condemned it. The closest you can get is Pope Pius X saying that democracy can be tolerated if it does not go against Catholic principle. There is also an issue of the fact that the external person, or in our case the masses, cannot always understand the internal logic or reasoning behind a policy or action, making it harder still to be well informed. Next, the author returns to this problem that the masses may desire the immoral. The author argues that as a Catholic, it would not matter if 55% of the population voted to oppress 0.9% of the population. It is in principle wrong. And so it is equally true in an opposite scenario. Doing good despite the democratic will is good. He gives the example of a sinking steamboat, where everyone is clamoring to get on lifeboats. In such a scenario, if a man were to fire a gun into the air, instill fear in the people, and under the threat of violence, command them to peacefully evacuate the ship, This action, although unwanted by the people, would be good as the outcome was good. The author then speculates on the morality of revolution, saying it is hard to judge when it is a morally justified action, also noting that violence of such a magnitude is seldom justified. Finally, he remarks that whatever good was brought by the French Revolution was outweighed by the overwhelmingly bad things it brought. Chapter 5: The Political Temper of Catholic Nations. I will say for the viewers, this is where the topic shifts from talking about democracy, egalitarianism, and liberty to primarily being a critique of Protestantism. It is related to the broader thesis, and it ties a link from Lutheranism to democracy to totalitarianism, but it's more about Protestantism than anything, in my opinion. The social implications of Catholicism. Catholicism, and religion in general for that matter, has a profound effect on individuals, shaping their beliefs, attitudes, and motivations. For our purposes here, what is chiefly being pointed out is the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism in its effect on society. The chief point being that what makes Protestantism distinct from Catholicism has been flipped over time. Basically, the old school view of Protestants was based on being extremely religious, strict, rigorous, and being God-centered rather than focusing on fads and being worldly. And the criticism from Protestants was that Catholics embodied this opposite. They embodied things like being lazy and worldly. However, this is flipped, especially for the liberal Protestant. The Protestants now will accuse the Catholic of not conforming to modern society, being too strict, ignoring the world too much. The comparison continues, noting that Protestantism is essentially a medieval worldview, giving the example of Gothic-style churches which died in Europe but continued in Protestant America much longer. Basically, the Catholic Church has the capacity to absorb and change in such a way that it does not affect her dogma. The Catholic Church has the dogma of theosis. Man, through sanctification, becomes more like God. This dogma puts the emphasis on God and man. Protestantism and sola deo gloria is a rejection of this view. The difference is that Catholic culture is always, in a way, progressive, attempting as a nation to be more godly. So things such as the Renaissance artwork of pagan gods can be embraced and synthesized into the body of the Church in the pursuit of higher sanctification. Protestantism was a reactionary movement to stay in the Dark Ages and return to a medieval reverence, severity, and strictness. An analog comparison is made with art, which can be seen as a cultural output. Compare the Birth of Venus as an artwork to American Gothic to see what he means. This is to say that the American Protestant still has or is inhabited by the medieval mindset. Now on to the big reformers, Luther and Calvin. He says that these reformers had metaphysical severity in their theology, but were less strict in terms of ecclesiology. This is the opposite for the Catholic Church, which has a strict hierarchy and ecclesiology, but is diverse in theology. This led Luther and Calvin to having quite radical views, Calvin making a totalitarian police state out of Geneva, and Luther having an extremely low view of man as a fallen creature. This finally leads to the argument that Huss, a proto-Protestant, so to speak, Luther and Calvin, set in place the seeds that would lead to democracy becoming popular in Europe. Democratic values, after all, are more strongly felt in Protestantism than Catholicism. Catholic dogma and its overall worldview is hierarchical in nature and does not lend itself to democracy. Not to say that the lowest people in Catholic society have no hope of being saved. There are plenty of saints of common origin and plenty of popes and kings in hell. Rather, it is that the hierarchy of knowledge and capability is top-down and very strict. Furthermore, the Catholic society does not have the view of equality. Yes, every soul at birth is spiritually equal, but no adult is. Time, experience, and everything else naturally leads to some being more sanctified than others. A limited sense of spiritual equality is seen from the fact that man cannot judge another soul and know how holy that man is. So, only in a very limited way can we act as if people are equal. And finally, everyone is actually equal in the sense that everyone dies and must face the same Lord. For this reason, the author says that Catholic society can be thanatocentric. Calvinism, like the Old Testament, takes physical riches and material wealth as a sign of favor from the Lord, meaning that industriousness is highly valued. Conversely, in a Catholic nation, the case is not so, especially for commercialism, reminding us that the only people Christ physically attacked were the moneylenders in the temple. From this, the author states that capitalism is a product of Protestantism, also saying that Protestantism, leading to the separation of church and state, causes theological issues where the church must raise money to support itself. The author reiterates that Catholicism is more hierarchical and is not democratic. It is, however, demophilic. Catholicism's paternal nature and theological nature leads to a more agrarian attitude rather than an urban, cosmopolitan one. Finally, saying that a Catholic society, when correctly established, is happy, sane, and fertile, but has had issues in the past due to revolution and strife entering her world. He states that the French Revolution is an example of this. Cultural changes brought by the French Revolution still reverberate through French society, damaging it to this day. Also, he states that the French Revolution was a product of Protestant dialectics. The author then argues that the only real way to bring stability back to the Catholic world is if either Catholicism goes away or if the Catholic way of life is fully reinstituted. The Catholic character. Catholicism and democracy simply do not mix. This is because, as a religion, Catholicism is more rigid and unpliable. So it was bound to fail when it comes to the democratic system, which is built off of compromise. Again, this is why democracy has been so successful in Protestant countries, as the religion of Protestantism is more open to relativism. Furthermore, Protestantism is characterized by fideism, whereas Catholicism by reason and logic. For this reason, the Catholic character is incompatible with democracy. To explain further, a Catholic will not consent to agreed dissent, which is needed for democratic nations, as from a logical point of view, something is either right or wrong. Why would you accept or tolerate the incorrect? This has an interesting effect, where Catholic nations tend to have more political violence than Protestant ones. While the common person may say that individualism, diversity, and freedom are more Protestant values, and the values of collectivism, uniformity, and authority are more Catholic, when you compare Catholic nations, this is not so. Which would you consider to have a more freedom-loving, rule-breaking people? England or Ireland? Spain or Sweden? This goes back to the fact that Protestant enforcement of authority comes mainly from society, whereas Catholic enforcement of authority is political. Hence the quote from Thomas Jefferson: "The country which has given to the world the example of physical liberty owes to it that of moral emancipation also, for as yet it is but nominal with us. The inquisition of public opinion overwhelms in practice the freedom asserted by the law in theory." This is the difference. This difference means that, in practice, Catholic culture allows for more personal freedom than Protestant. Furthermore, this Catholic stubbornness, for lack of a better term, makes Catholic armies less disciplined and less compliant to authority. In Catholic nations, the soldiers must be thoroughly convinced of the sensibleness of the conflict, whereas in Protestant nations, one must simply appeal to duty. This means that desertions and mutiny are more common in Catholic armies. The author then goes on to talk about how the Protestants have a lower view of free will than the Catholics, and that due to Catholic doctrine, it is possible for pagans, Jews, and non-Christians to be saved. Next, it is brought up that Catholics are encouraged to follow their conscience and beliefs, that it is a mortal sin not to embrace new beliefs if you wholeheartedly believe them. For this reason, he states that it is very possible that Jan Hus, the Czech proto-Protestant founder of the Moravian Church, went to heaven after being burned at the stake for being a heretic. Catholicism and political behavior. Our whole political machinery presupposes a people so fundamentally at one they can safely afford to bicker, and so sure of their own moderation that they are not dangerously disturbed by the never-ending din of political conflict. Professor Lasky. This is not how Catholic nations are, however. For example, look at the First Republic of Austria. The absolutism mentioned leads to democracy not working. Anyway, back to Protestantism. The absolutism that has been mentioned in Catholic nations leads to democracy not working. As for Protestantism, he goes on to point out that Protestant nations are irrational and relativistic. Here he states liberal Protestants can be a Lutheran who doubts the virgin birth, a Freemason, and a socialist despite how intellectually schizophrenic such a position actually is. Here he repeats things already said on the differences between Protestantism and Catholicism, saying that Protestantism is more oppressive with horizontal social pressure and such, so I'll save you the time and move on. Basically, the absolutist nature of Catholic culture, when put into a democracy, will lead to a frozen democracy where nothing happens, or a democracy that is overthrown by radicals who do not tolerate the status quo. He then goes on to talk about how the Catholic nations lean more to anarchist forms of socialism due to their libertine cultural bent, and that in Catholic nations where communism is more popular, like in Italy, it is because of the fact that Italians presuppose some kind of liberal Protestantism rather than the statist style communism. In other words, they've been tricked. He then talks about this one time when Arnaldo Mussolini wrote positively of two anarchists who died, representing the fact that Catholics have a soft spot for the anarchist movement, even among the far right. Next, Catholicism is anti-bourgeois, and that the urban middle classes are the ones who lead towards ideas such as National Socialism, Communism, and totalitarianism. If you read the book, you can tell he implies throughout the book that the bourgeois middle class religion is Protestantism, basically making a link between the worst ideologies of the 20th century and Protestantism. Then he goes on to say that racialism in Catholic countries was always weak because the Catholic Church was international and interracial. To finish, Catholic nations are cynical, undisciplined, individualistic, violent, and uncooperative. His words, not mine. Catholicism and forms of government. First, it must be repeated that Catholicism is demophilic, not democratic. The Church loves the people, but is against the institution of democracy. And again, Catholic nations have allowed for more personal liberty than Protestant ones. democracy transitions into tyranny much faster than it transitions into monarchy. For this reason, after the first attempt at democracy in Europe, we got tyranny and war. From earlier, we can understand that the Catholic nation is not compatible with democracy, but rather it is Protestant nations that have a better time with it. At the time of writing, the Protestant population of Europe was 13%, so the crusade to force democracy onto Europe was bound to fail. Furthermore, the nations of Russia, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, Spain, Portugal, and Albania had far less civil liberty in 1952, the year the book was published, than they did in 1900. The historic situation of Germany, France, and Italy has not been much better. Ironically, though, because Protestantism is more relativistic and more conducive to synthesis and middle ground, monarchy has done better at surviving in Protestant countries, though in the form of ceremonial leaders rather than anything meaningful. The author shares his doubts that nations like Spain, Austria, and Italy will have a successful democracy in the foreseeable future. He brings up an interesting point, that in the European mindset, the good old times were before World War I. The time of European peace and cultural dominance was under a monarchical system. But this return to monarchy is unlikely, as the USA and the USSR, which controlled Europe at the time, would never allow it. For better or for worse, Catholic nations that would function well under monarchy probably won't become as such anytime soon. For Spain especially, which seems to be either led by a Catholic mission under monarchy, or will break into separatist factions in the future. An idea credited to Joseph de Maistre stood out to me here. Quote, "Large nations can only be ruled by religion or slavery." Unquote. I don't know why, I just thought it was worth including that. He then turns to South America, which in 1952 democracy was not doing well. He implies that what would make this part of the world accept democracy would be outside influence, and would require for these places to transform in order to accept this new style of regime. He finally ends the chapter by stating that those who do evil do it in the name of doing good, and that Europe's path to freedom is through monarchy. Chapter 5: Hus, Luther, and National Socialism. This chapter and the next chapter can be read as one giant argument. The thesis is that Protestantism, especially Lutheranism, laid the cultural groundwork necessary for the National Socialists to take power in Germany. He also points out in these two chapters that this kind of thing could only take off in the mainstream in Germany specifically because of the fact that Germany at the time was a Protestant and Catholic nation, basically taking the absolutism from Catholicism and the egalitarian and nationalism from Lutheranism. Also, these last chapters and the postscript will be a lot shorter as it's easier to summarize, so I'm going to try and blitz through them very quickly. Basically, the argument is best summarized by this figure on the screen. Introduction. Basically, the argument is best summarized by this figure on the screen. Huss influenced Luther, Mussolini, and Czech socialism, and Mussolini and Czech socialism are the precursors to German National Socialism. Luther influenced Kant, Kant influenced Marx, Marx influenced socialism, and socialism was behind Czech socialism. Calvin and Luther were precursors to democracy, and the French Revolution, which led to democracy in Germany, which led to German National Socialism. Furthermore, Luther was for state absolutism, which allowed for National Socialism. That may have been too much to take in at once, so I suggest you pause the video and take a look at the figure for a moment before continuing on. On a side note, when I first read this part of the book, I thought J. Dyer would froth this. Some things to keep in mind about these ideologies, socialism, ethnic nationalism, fascism, etc., is that they are anti-Catholic, anti-liberal, and all claim to be democratic. Furthermore, they are materialistic, collectivistic, and claim to be progressive. Finally, all of these ideologies can be traced back to the French Revolution. At first, Luther was fairly ignorant of Huss, and Luther's position on Huss changed over time, though Huss is considered a forerunner to Luther, and Huss prophesied the coming of Luther himself. Before he was burned at the stake for heresy in 1415, he said the following, quote, "You are going to burn a goose, but in 100 years you will have a swan which you can neither roast nor boil." In 1517, Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door of his church. The influence of Huss on Luther is generally difficult to pin down, but it is there, and what is more important, Huss laid the foundation. Because of Huss, the ideas of Luther were more acceptable to the public. After all, the Bohemians sided with the Protestants during the 30 Years' War. Finally, on Wycliffe, the English proto-Protestant, we can say the same thing. Thanks to his efforts, when Luther's ideas swept the continent, Tyndale had an easier time in England, as the views of Wycliffe had been previously circulated, though Tyndale was eventually executed. Lutheranism in the rise of National Socialism. This part can be summed up very quickly. There is no direct link between National Socialism and Lutheranism, but there are overlaps in their views. Luther was a totalitarian, believing that God uses the state to inflict suffering on the people as a punishment for man's fallen nature. This is a radical statist view, and this view makes totalitarianism more palatable for the Lutheran. Furthermore, Luther was anti-reason and pro-fideism, which lends well to National Socialist ideology. Next, if you look at the percentage of National Socialist votes in Germany and compare it to the percentage of Catholics in Germany, you get an interesting image. Basically, the majority of the National Socialist voter base was Protestant. Next, Luther was anti-Jewish, though his hatred of the Jews came from his religious views rather than his racial views. He even wrote a plan to exterminate the Jews from Germany in 1534. In Scandinavia, the reason they did not become National Socialist like the Germans did was because the Reformation was less violent and more to do with politics than being a genuine religious revolution, somewhat akin to Anglicanism in England. Evolution of Protestantism and European politics. This segment is more so to argue that even if there was no direct link between modern secular politics and Protestantism, there certainly is a dialectical one. Protestantism was a reformation that came with it extrinsic and intrinsic changes. The intrinsic changes have been covered by many historians, including G.P. Gooch, R.H. Tawney, Christopher Dawson, and others. But for the extrinsic changes, there is much to be said. The first thing to note is that Catholicism was far more overwhelming in regards to all aspects of life. There is Catholic political theory, economic theory, social theory, etc. That is to say, Catholicism is more holistic and offers many things besides just theology. So what happens when the Reformation comes and strips much of that away? First, we see secularism. Protestant society does have a culture lightly influenced by its religion, but not to the same extent that Catholicism influences the culture of Catholic nations. Next was authority. Catholicism has a church magisterium that determines and protects the dogma. This authority was thrown out and led to the world influencing the church instead of an immobile church influencing the world. On this, the stereotype of Protestantism is brought up, that being the idea of the strict, severe, and reverent Protestant does not really exist today. Progressive Protestantism and evangelicalism dominate the Protestant world and are, honestly, nothing like the Protestantism of old. On a personal note, however, this type of Protestantism is making a small comeback with the Christian movement Operation Reconquista led by redeemed Zuma, but only time will tell how successful that is going to be. The author then goes on to repeat that Calvin and Luther led to the French Revolution, and that Luther had an influence on Marx through Kant and Hegel. He then jumps back to Protestantism, where he makes this analogy of a ship, where Protestantism set out originally to fix or remove earthly influence from the church. But what happened is that the changes they started is what became their undoing, and the world began to seep back into the ship of Protestantism over time. Going to National Socialism again, the Protestant anti-clericalism is something that was a part of the National Socialist dogma. This vacuum that the Protestants made by destroying Catholic institutions had to be filled somehow. In regards to culture and politics, it became filled with ideology, which in 1930s Germany was filled by the National Socialists. Furthermore, this is not helped by the fact that the Protestant world at this time was more irreligious than the Catholic. Finally, it is reiterated that Protestantism was the precursor to democracy, and democracy was the precursor to National Socialism. The other treads in the ideological development of Nazism. Not only is Protestantism illiberal and leans towards totalitarianism, but the separation of church and state gave way for totalitarianism, because in Catholic nations the state must contend with the church, monarchy, and the liberal nature of the Catholic people. For this reason, Italy was far less totalitarian than Germany or Russia in the 20th century. Due to the Lutheran attitude that the state is a form of God's punishment, Lutherans were more willing to accept and tolerate totalitarianism also. On to some history. Calvinism and its illiberalism has historically had an effect on the Prussian state, as the Hohenzollerns were strongly influenced by the migration of French Huguenots. It was after this point that the strict, aggressive Protestant character of Prussia was born. This is also the start of the French influence on Prussia. Franco-Prussian sympathies were well between the two states, and French ideas found themselves being accepted in Prussia. Ideas such as clarté and plairin de absolu being against moderation. The Protestants had an absolutist mindset and always took conclusions to their bitter end. This attitude is common for Catholic nations. The Protestants had this too for a while. If one looks back to 16th and 17th century Britain and America, we can see it. The culture that led to National Socialism is due to Prussia's perfect storm of Catholic absolutism and Protestant secularism and democratic nature. Finally, it is important to note that National Socialism in Germany was thoroughly anti-Catholic and anti-clerical. The Catholic Church and Catholics under the regime were often dissenters and were heavily persecuted by the state. The rise of the National Socialist Party. Once more, democracy and liberty. This is just reiterating the thesis of the book and stating that Americans were shocked when German equality did not give birth to liberty, despite these two values being very different and not mutually inclusive. The Hussite root of National Socialism. In Bohemia, the German and Czech populations were actually pretty similar. There were many ethnic German nobles who would take on Czech first names. Bohemia did not have much Latin influence despite being Catholic, which puts it in contrast to France or Italy, it was to a certain extent, originally, anti-Catholic. Huss had little influence on Luther, but he did have a strong influence on the Bohemian people. After all, the Moravian Church is Hussite. The Taborites, as well, who were Hussites, had many characteristics like being pro-Czech language and ethnic nationalists. Because of all this, Huss, Jan Žižka, and the Taborites became a symbol of Czech nationalism. Czech nationalism was founded, in other words, on Hussite ideology. People like Miroslav Tieš and the Sokol movement echoed a lot of the same ideas that Huss and Žižka originally established: anti-clericalism, nationalism, militarism, and democracy. When industrialization came to Bohemia and Moravia in the late 1800s, socialist parties began to form. But keep in mind the unique character of the Czechs. Because of their religion, they had very strong nationalist sentiments. Soon, a National Socialist Party was formed, the first National Socialist Party, which still exists today. This party was very much different from the German National Socialist Party. However, for example, it was never anti-Semitic, simply pro-nationalist, pro-socialist, anti-clerical, and it was aligned with the workers, peasants, and petty bourgeoisie, beginnings of German National Socialism. So, how did the National Socialist Party of Czechia lead to the National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterparty, NSDAP, of Germany? The answer comes to us from the German Workers' Party of Bohemia and Moravia. You can think of this as the first little proto-NSDAP. And I mean that in all seriousness, by 1893 they already had a nationalist, anti-Semitic, pan-German socialist organization. On a side note, I think it's now important to talk about socialism. The socialism of this party is very distinct from that of communism or how we imagine socialism today. One must keep in mind that socialism is an umbrella term. The socialism advocated for by these organizations is called state socialism, a more lukewarm corporatist system. The closest thing we have today would probably be the Nordic model. This socialism still involves private ownership of most of the means of production, but with more state intervention, social programs, wealth redistribution, and some state-owned industries. This is important to note, as these workers and socialists were anti-Marx, and will be anti-Bolshevik when Bolshevism becomes a thing. Anyway, there was a German nationalist workers' meeting in 1898, and in 1902 we see the National Organization of Nationalistic Workers, with a member count of approximately 26,000, being renamed to the German Political Workers' Union for Austria. This organization, by November 1903, was renamed into the German Workers' Party, or the Deutsche Arbeiterparty in Österreich. Keep in mind, at this time, it was still a fledgling movement, on the edge of German-speaking lands. But this is, in essence, the same party with the same vision as Mustache Man. In May 1918, the party changed its name to the German National Socialist Workers' Party, or the Deutsche Nationalsozialistische Arbeiterparty. At this time, Mustache Man was still fighting as a lance corporal in France. I will read an excerpt of their beliefs that was quoted in the book. Quote, "The German National Socialist Workers' Party is not a party exclusively for laborers. It stands for the interest of every decent and honest enterprise. It is a liberal and strictly folkic party fighting against all reactionary efforts, clerical, feudal, and capitalistic privileges, but before all against the increasing influence of the Jewish commercial mentality which encroaches on public life. It demands amalgamation of all European regions inhabited by Germans into a democratic and socialized Germany. It demands the introduction of plebiscites for all important laws in the country. It demands the elimination of the rule of Jewish banks over our economic life and the establishment of people's banks under democratic control. Just to point out, as is the case in America today, Jews were overrepresented in positions of power, which did include the commercial and industrial sector. For this reason, even in Austria, socialism took an anti-Semitic turn, as there was an association between being Jewish and being bourgeois, or part of the bourgeoisie. The reason this may not have happened with the Czech National Socialists in the same region is because the Czech economy was more agrarian and less industrial, so this sort of association may not have been able to take hold. Anyway, back to the book. In 1918, a branch of this party was organized in the city of Munich, Germany, by one Anton Dexler. The connection to the DNSAP is via the Free Committee for a German Workers' Peace. This offshoot, in 1919, would change its name to the German Workers' Party, or the Deutsche Arbeiter Party. This party is important because a certain man, we all know as Mustache Man, the bad guy of World War II, joined this particular party. This party in 1920 renamed itself to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterparty. Now that we've traced the origin of the party, I'll tell you the final points in the chapter of this book. The DNSAP was banned in Austria in 1933. The NSDAP did not really take off until they managed to break out of the Catholic parts of Germany. And when you look at the election results from 1928 to 1933, the votes they managed to sway were of the moderates, Democratic, and Liberal parties, whereas the Catholic, National Conservative, Socialist, and Communist parties did not really see their seats taken by the NSDAP. The final point of this chapter is that the elements that allowed the NSDAP to rise in 1933 in Germany still exists as undercurrents in America today at the time of writing, 1952. Summary. There's not much information here besides that people seem to attribute the rise of the NSDAP to particular philosophers like Nietzsche or Oswald Spengler, but thoroughly forget the cultural and social changes that led to their rise. The author notes here that the book has been very critical and not very prescriptive when it comes to sound alternatives to democracy. So he is going to try, in this section of the book, give a prescription to America. The first thing to keep in mind is the psychological character of a nation. For the same reason that the Roman Republic would never be able to tolerate returning to a monarchy, the American people would not as well. Therefore, a return to monarchy for America is not plausible. Secondly, the Constitution is a means to an end. The end being freedom, well-being, and the preservation of the American people. Therefore, one can give two different constitutions to two different nations for the same end, depending on the character of these nations. Now onto a blueprint for America. First, let's establish our goals. 1. The greatest possible liberty that is reasonably attainable. 2. The abolishment of the party system. 3. Ideological struggle must be manifest outside the government, not be made part of it. 4. Majority rule cannot overrule reason, rationality, and utilitarianism. So what is the system? Imagine a semi-constitutional monarchy, but replace the monarchy with bureaucracy. There would be an organization that people can freely vote to elect the members of. This will be called the corporative diet. There will be the bureaucracy, which we will call the executive administrating body, or just the executive for short, which will be made up of people who are employees who have passed a test and have worked for 2 years as a sort of trial run to see if they are competent. It is important to note that the corporative diet does not represent the people per se, but lobby groups. This is an attempt to de-partyify the elected leaders, as they will now represent particular interests instead of being members of a particular party. If a law is introduced by the corporative diet, it can be vetoed by the executive, the Supreme Court, or the head of state. If a law is introduced by the executive, it can be vetoed by the corporative diet, the Supreme Court, or the head of state. The role of the head of state in this setup is to basically act like a kind of umpire between the corporative diet and the executive. The Supreme Court will also be given a representative in the corporative diet who will be elected by the church or churches and universities. The author notes that this might be a tall order in a religiously diverse nation, though I doubt it would be too tall an order in 1950s America. We could today replace churches with religious organizations to make it work in 2025. This whole state apparatus would be bound by a constitution that would strictly define the limits of power and individual rights of the people, including free speech, freedom of association, private property, yada yada yada. Any sort of democracy would only be allowed on small local levels, as what we are avoiding here is mass democracy with an anonymous voter base. Democracy on a county or town level hardly has the same implications. Finally, parties can still exist and propagandize to the public and government, but by not having a role in government, the destructive pattern of ideology and power can be avoided. The benefit of such a system is that dissident thought can be allowed to survive, as there is no political cost associated with it. The government will by nature be top-down or elite, but this is not necessarily a bad thing. One has to keep in mind that the king in medieval times often had far less political power than our parliaments and bureaucracies have today. This is an attempt to outline a stable, just, and minimal government. Then the author notes that under democracy, the quality of government has actually gotten worse, even though the need for greater quality is higher as the world becomes an ever-increasingly complicated place. He then gives an analogy. If you were on a boat and desperately needing surgery, who would you trust? An old mediocre surgeon or some savant who was great at philosophy and public speaking, who would read a medical book and then perform surgery for the first time? You would go with the surgeon, right? Likewise, the career statesmen can be trusted to perform their duties better than career politicians. You won't get such a thing in democracy. Back to monarchy. Monarchy has never claimed to be perfect. It acknowledges the flawed nature of humanity and takes that in account in the state. However, most post-monarchical regimes have some promise of utopia, fixing all the problems and being the end of history, and so on. Another thing to note is that with our democracy, People will often be tricked into giving away personal liberty for the sake of things like security or economic prosperity, but this will often just be a lie. Ironically, democracy has been far worse for liberty. Its instability leads to totalitarianism. Its system demands conformism. The persecution of the Jews in the Middle Ages does not even come close to what the Germans did in the 20th century. The number of innocents sent to death in war under modern regimes has been far greater than that in older regimes. Civil conflict under our democratic regime is not a bug, it's a feature. If you think by having a democracy where people can be put against each other on the grounds of ideology, you will have a peaceful society, you're kidding yourself. And on a personal note, I think it's important to note that ideological division is going to get worse and worse as the left and right become more polarized. I think conflict is coming. Finally, America is bad. The USA has propped up democracy and propagandized the project of democracy in Europe, as well as to the rest of the world. This is not helping anyone, but is causing more strife and death. Written in 1952, by the way, before American interventionism. If we want a free society, America needs to give up and return to being a polity or republic, and Europe must return to monarchy if it wants to thrive. That is the end of the book. Um, this is probably going to be my biggest project yet. If you have made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. I appreciate every single one of you who watches this. That is all. I am Sinner, and I'll see you in the next one. Let me know if you want me to make more videos like this or more book reviews or what you like. Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, see ya.